It is one of the most contentious and horrific events after the departure of the Prophet of Islam. A suspicious death shrouded in mystery, and one that holds the key to understanding much of what goes on today.
It's a seminal event that forever altered the course of Islamic history. And if you consider the colossal impact that Islam has had on human development, it's an incident that has shaped the trajectory of the entire world. A dark episode which sparked an endless spate of deadly conspiracies and plots and went on to shed rivers of blood ever since.
The ambush on the house of the Prophet immediately after his death led to the killing of his only surviving daughter, Fatima. One expects high-profile homicide cases to be eventually solved and the culprits to be held accountable. Yet there has been a systematic and well-orchestrated campaign to conceal this murder for 1,000 years. That's because exposing this crime will send shockwaves across the world and shatter centuries of misplaced veneration and false idolization.
This event forms a part of Shia beliefs as it allows us to make sense of the chaotic formative period of early Islamic history, as well as the savagery and pandemonium that we see today, from groups like ISIS, whose leadership openly claims allegiance to the alleged perpetrators of this crime. Now, of course, the event is either vehemently denied by the majority of Muslims, or it's distorted by their scholars. So it's a point of heated contention, to say the least. But the mass of evidence we will present, shocking as it is to many, is not the product of abstract speculations. We don't expect you to convict the perpetrators on the testimony of their foes. There is no count in our indictment that cannot be proved by reliable books and records. The attackers spoke about their crimes with a sense of pride and have been quoted by their friends and close associates. Once you've seen the evidence, you will want to convict them with their own words. And despite meticulous censorship and attempts to obfuscate the truth, it's clear as daylight. There's a saying in criminology and among forensics experts, there is no such thing as a perfect crime. This couldn't be truer in this case, because no amount of masking and camouflage can hide divine truth. Look, I get it. People don't like to have their fundamental beliefs challenged. We feel a sense of safety in knowing that what we grew up thinking is true, and our parents were right, and so were their parents, and so on. It's our comfort zone, and if anyone tries to present a different perspective or suggest that we're misguided, we get defensive and will either get angry and confrontational or shut off and dismiss them. Think about it. That's why you can't argue with, say, a right-wing white supremacist. It's why you can't argue with anyone who isn't open to the idea that perhaps their side has something of value that's worth listening to. And while most Muslims agree that interfaith dialogue has a net benefit and that trying to listen to each other is a good thing, when it comes to bridging Shia-Sunni differences, most people fall back into either shutting off or aggressive sectarianism. But if you're open-minded enough to engage with the atheist and the Buddhist and the Jew and the Christian, then why not your own Muslim brother who is Shia? The one who believes in the same God, the same prophet, the same Quran, same basic tenets as you, but relies on your books to present a very different view of Islam's historical trajectory. All we ask is that you hear us out. As we shall see, there's a mountain of evidence to suggest that Fatima was oppressed, that she was deeply hurt, that her home was ambushed, and that she was physically injured. And ultimately, she miscarried her unborn son. All of that at the orders of the caliphate. This is from mainstream, credible Sunni sources. See, such evidence shouldn't exist, and the fact that it does is nothing short of a miracle, because it helps us see the full picture, free from filters and visual effects designed to falsify the truth and come to grips with the ugly underbelly of our history. Let me share an example to illustrate. Imagine you get a urinalysis, and your doctor calls to inform you that you have what they call hematuria, which means you have trace amounts of blood in your urine. Now, this is never good news because it can be a sign of bladder cancer. Nobody wants to see that. But the silver lining is that without this sign, you wouldn't have discovered the tumor growing inside of you. And you wouldn't have been allowed sufficient time to do something about it and maybe save your life. So, the evidence we will examine suggests the presence of a far more dangerous ideological tumor. And while it's a horrifying thought, we all owe it to ourselves to at least investigate. Ignoring these questions won't fix the problem or make it go away. It certainly won't bring about any real and lasting harmony, which is what we all want. But more important than that is that dismissing these uncomfortable, inconvenient truths is a travesty of justice and an act of oppression against the Prophet of God, and perpetuates the painful schism that occurred after the Prophet's passing. Bukhari even narrates the Prophet watching on Judgment Day as some of his companions will be led away towards hell. When he inquires about it, God tells him, "You do not know what they did after your death."
Muslims are generally divided into two major sects, Shia and Sunni. The Shiite assert the Prophet would not leave his nation in disarray, and that he repeatedly appointed his protege, Imam Ali, as his successor. Ali was also the Prophet's cousin, his son-in-law, and the executor of his will. The Shiite, therefore, believed that a bloody coup d'etat was waged against Ali and eventually installed Abu Bakr as the caliph. As with any coup, the legitimate leader became the primary target as he represents the biggest threat to their rule. So the first act of the conspirators was an attack on the house of the Prophet's daughter, Fatima, and her husband, Ali, the subject of this investigation. The pro-regime narrative, however, maintains that the caliph assumed power peacefully and with the unanimous consent of everyone. Subsequently, they deny any attack ever occurred. Yet the slightest scrutiny will reveal the true face of this rosy picture.
Now, I'm sure the word coup makes a lot of people uncomfortable. After all, the repercussions of any such acts of insurrection are enormous and both politically and theologically earth-shattering. It casts a shadow of doubt over the character of the companions. But see, here's the thing. The Quran predicted that it would happen as soon as the Prophet died, or perhaps got killed. God says in Surah Al-Imran, verse number 144, وَمَا مُحَمَّدٌ إِلَّا رَسُولٌ قَدْ خَلَتْ مِنْ قَبْلِهِ الرُّسُلُ أَفَإِن مَّاتَ أَوْ قُتِلَ انقَلَبْتُمْ عَلَىٰ أَعْقَابِكُمْ وَمَن يَنقَلِبْ عَلَىٰ عَقِبَيْهِ فَلَن يَضُرَّ اللَّهَ شَيْئًا وَسَيَجْزِي اللَّهُ الشَّاكِرِينَ. Now, note how both the Arabic word for coup and the word used in this verse are exactly the same. انقلب ينقلب انقلاب, which means to turn back on your heels. In the context of this verse, it means to defect and become apostates, which is a reference to the morass that followed the Prophet's passing ipso facto. Of course, many Muslims today find it extremely difficult to believe that the companions would turn their back on their heels. And it's precisely because of the seriousness of this claim that the Quran describes how the Israelites did exactly that when Moses went missing for just 40 days. I mean, think about it. These were people who had suffered under the Pharaoh. They had witnessed miracles. They had seen with their own eyes how Moses parted the sea, and yet suddenly, as soon as Moses was gone, they do a U-turn, essentially. The Quran quotes Moses as cursing them and declaring, قَالَ رَبِّ إِنِّي لَا أَمْلِكُ إِلَّا نَفْسِي وَأَخِي فَافْرُقْ بَيْنَنَا وَبَيْنَ الْقَوْمِ الْفَاسِقِينَ. My Lord, I have no one but myself and my brother. So all the companions of Moses, everyone who was around him, they're all gone, leaving just him and his brother. Then Moses says, so part between me and the impious people. High-ranking and celebrated Sunni collector of hadith, he reports the Prophet as having warned his nation that they will follow in the footsteps of the Israelites. So perhaps we should take our blinders off and see the truth for what it is. instead of buying into this fantastical fairy tale that every single person in Medina was some kind of angel, when in fact lots of demons also roamed those streets.
One quick look and it's easy to see that the Caliphate's narrative has large, gaping holes in both the event's timeline and consistency.
Some of the questions that have not been answered include, number one, what was Fatima's cause of death? Given her young age and lack of any reports of illness, any coroner would conduct an investigation, with homicide considered a distinct possibility. Number two, why was Fatima buried at night? As the Prophet's only child, and in accordance with general Islamic customs, she should have been buried in broad daylight and in a public fashion, allowing everyone to participate. Number three, why was her funeral attended by just her family and the close companions of Ali? As the new ruler, shouldn't Abu Bakr participate in honor of the Prophet's daughter? Number four, we actually know the answer to that question, but it raises more problems yet. Prominent Sunni sources like Bukhari acknowledge that Fatima specifically instructed her husband not to allow the caliph and his cronies to attend. But if they were all on good terms, why would she want to disassociate from them in life and in death, which was designed to highlight the fact that she was embittered with them for eternity? And number five, why is her exact burial site still unknown? While every one of the top companions, wives, and even B-grade hypocrites have identifiable graves, Fatima has none. There are speculations as to where she might be buried, vague references like at the cemetery or at her house, but those are mere claims as there has never been any shrine or tombstone, because she left clear instructions for the grave of the mistress of the women of paradise to be forever hidden. The question is though, why? Why leave a wound that can never heal?
These questions form the pieces of a bigger puzzle, a pile of conundrums that's only going to get bigger and more questionable, exposing major cracks in the official narrative.
Now let's talk about why all of this matters.
The question of whether there was a bloody coup, and specifically a deadly attack on the house of Fatima, is needless to say, shockingly explosive. It is important in establishing the legality of the caliphate. If indeed there was an attack, that government would lose any trace of legitimacy. The status of Fatima in the eyes of all Muslims means the mere hint of foul play in her untimely death demands a response from proponents of the regime. Implicating the caliph will forever disqualify him and other assailants from assuming any position of authority in politics or indeed in religion, as it would irreparably tarnish their character.
Every Muslim would agree that an attack on the house of Fatima is tantamount to an attack on the Prophet himself and therefore God. Because the regime's relationship with Fatima determines their relationship with the source of their authority, that is, the Messenger of God. If they treat her well, then they've treated the Prophet well, and it means that they have some sense of legitimacy. But if they don't, what does that tell you about them? It's easy to justify the actions of an oppressive government. Bootlicking sellouts have done that since the dawn of time. But the repercussions of siding with tyrants on Judgment Day is as severe as committing the crimes themselves. Now you have to know that this isn't purely an academic pursuit. We're trying to discover the truth of what happened to the daughter of the Holy Prophet and why she was buried at night, and her grave is forever concealed. Knowing the story behind these tragedies isn't a mere intellectual endeavor, but a moral mandate and a historic necessity. Where you stand on this issue will determine whether you stand with the Prophet and his family on Judgment Day or with the people whose characters are dubious at best. We're not trying to antagonize anyone or cause any sectarian tensions, but we do wish to objectively analyze the historical narrative and unlock this mystery. If there could be some sort of consensus on that, then there will be common ground that we can build on. You are, of course, free to believe what you want, but we all have both the right and the obligation to make informed decisions. Given the contentious and emotional nature of these discussions, obviously there are going to be inherent biases that we all possess. But we do ask that you set aside any presuppositions and judgments and view the evidence presented with as much objectivity as humanly possible, so that we can draw accurate conclusions and hopefully know the truth. This brings us to an important question that many viewers may ask. If these allegations are true, why have we never heard about them? Didn't Sunni scholars know all of this? The answer is yes, they did. It's impossible not to see the mountain of evidence, because for every lying, conniving imposter, there were scholars who at least had the decency to report the events faithfully and without distortion. So many classical Sunni historians and scholars of hadith acknowledge these claims, as we will show later. But to them, the threat to kill Fatima and Ali and the subsequent ambush aren't important, because there's a bigger truth that they believe we should all focus on. That all companions were intrinsically good and truthful, and that they will all go to heaven. This, they insist, has primacy over all other things. Which brings us to the concept known as adalatul sahaba, the large elephant in any room where history is scrutinized. But surely you see how buying into this prevents any meaningful discussion of the obvious transgressions of those very fallible humans. It's a dangerous belief that requires every moral law to be broken and God's justice to be violated just to justify the actions of the people who use the cover of companionship to commit unspeakable sins. While no Sunni will openly claim that the companions of the Prophet were sinless, they are certainly treated this way, as any criticism directed toward them is seen as blasphemy of the highest order. In fact, many Sunni majority countries have codified this into law, and the merest denunciation of the companions, especially the caliphs, attracts the death penalty. This intellectual terrorism obviously hinders scholarly discourse. Plus, there is literally no Quranic evidence for the concept of the righteousness of the companions in the Quran. The Quran itself is filled with stories and anecdotes that prove the companions committed heinous acts of sin and transgression. And history is overflowing with their crimes and atrocities, not least of which was their intentional killing of each other, rendering their unconditional entry into paradise a farcical joke and a logical contradiction. The Quran states in emphatic terms, وَمَن يَقْتُلْ مُؤْمِنًا مُتَعَمِّدًا فَجَزَاؤُهُ جَهَنَّمْ خَالِدًا فِيهَا وَغَضِبَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَلَعَنَهُ وَأَعَدَّ لَهُ عَذَابًا عَظِيمًا. So, let us instead see the companions for who they were. Among them was the righteous. Also, there were the hell-bound wicked and the 50 shades of hypocrite. Giving every single person who saw the Prophet a halo of sanctity is to give them the kind of impunity that applies exclusively to God's greatest prophets. We will use exclusively mainstream Sunni authors, which means the discussion is biased in their favor. Imagine a prosecutor saying, we will only use statements by the defense to build our case. It's madness. But we've chosen to do that for 3 reasons. Number 1, that's how strong our case is. Most Sunnis have never felt compelled to defend anything but the status quo. That means their knowledge of their own books is extremely lacking. We will show them that despite centuries of book burnings and crime scene bleaching, there is conclusive evidence from their own books that the brutal ambush did take place. Number 2, Salafi scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah and those that followed him have displayed remarkable vitriol towards the Shia, partly because of their claims that Fatima was murdered. They have painted the Shia as a blaspheming, heretical, imposter group simply for acknowledging history and challenging establishment status quo. They have called the ambush on the house of Fatima a myth, a fable created by the Shia to exact some kind of vendetta against the so-called righteous caliphs. So, Instead of Shia references, we will present quotes from reliable Sunni sources, which are definitively binding for them. And finally, as far as the Shia audience is concerned, if we're able to successfully prove our point from the books of our ideological opponents, that makes our case much stronger and would convict the defendants beyond a reasonable doubt. That is because the Sunni side has vociferously denied any wrongdoing by the perpetrators and have spared no effort in trying to exonerate them despite the overwhelming evidence, as we shall see. So if their own mainstream books can demonstrate sufficient compelling evidence, then we can rest our case and no longer need to refer to our own sources. Just as when the prosecution obtains a written admission of guilt, it doesn't need to go to trial, let alone bring in eyewitnesses or supporting evidence. One thing that needs to be clarified right at the outset is it's illogical for the other side to demand that we present them with a smoking gun or evidence akin to flagrante delicto that conclusively implicates specific individuals without a shadow of doubt. Let me explain why before then going on to explain what kind of evidence we can expect. This kind of incontrovertible burden of proof is almost always non-existent. If you've ever debated an atheist, they'll have similar expectations. Show me the face of God on the moon, they'll say. Or if God is so real, why can't we see him? The Israelites said as much to Moses. They said to Moses, we won't believe you just because you claim that you spoke to God or you received these tablets or the 10 Commandments. None of that matters to us. We want to see God. Now, think of the overwhelming majority of your beliefs, and almost none of them meets that standard. Instead, you will build a case for your beliefs piece by piece until sufficient evidence accumulates to merit a guilty verdict. This is especially true of events that took place over 1,000 years ago. Also, could you imagine the repercussions if people actually spoke out and linked the caliph to the murder of the prophet's daughter? Accusing the caliph of ordering a high-stakes political assassination is by far the single fastest way to have your name added to the hit list. Any dictator can have you eliminated before the ink is dry.
If powerful politicians are good at anything, it's covering their tracks. Think of the Saudi regime's high-profile murder of dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi. After he's asphyxiated to death, his body gets chopped up with a chainsaw, and his remains poured down the drainage pipe. Then, in classic mob style, a lookalike was brought in to dupe the security cameras. If not for Turkish intelligence blowing the lid on the butchery, no one could implicate the Saudi crown prince. In this case, the defendants had 1,400 years to bleach history books from the caliph's fingerprints, but not without leaving a trail of corroborating evidence.
It is an established fact that the early caliphate was responsible for the goriest atrocities and war crimes imaginable. Think of the most despicable monstrosities ever committed by ISIS, the Taliban, and Boko Haram. Now multiply that by 1,000. Who could forget the murder of Malik ibn Nuwayrah, a celebrated companion of the Holy Prophet, who was praised by the Prophet, but refused to give allegiance to the coup leaders. So he was a Muslim, he prayed, he simply refused to acknowledge the new caliph. So the regime summons its top butcher, Khalid ibn al-Walid, who, as it turns out, had a thing for Malik's wife. So he ambushed Malik's camp, slit the throats of all the men, then proceeded to ransack their camp and rape his helpless, grieving widow, all while they burnt the severed heads in a bonfire. ISIS leaders were especially proud of this massacre and frequently cited it in their statements as justification for why it's okay to kill other Muslims. All this happened within weeks of the coup, and the savagery was intended to send a message to any potential dissenters that if you refuse to submit to our will, we'll stop at nothing to crush you. We will even go after your women. What's shocking is that no one denies this ghastly bloodbath. Instead, what Sunni scholars do is try to justify it by saying Malik was killed for refusing to pay religious taxes. So, under the righteous caliphate, if you so much as refuse to pay taxes, you're killed and your wife is taken as a sex slave. The caliph's temperament is also known to have been aggressive, to the point that he once beat a slave for losing a camel, all while he was in the state of ihram, when you're not supposed to hurt a fly, and all while the Prophet watched in disbelief, saying, "Look at this man, he's beating his slave while in the state of ihram." It's madness, pure madness. Umar even admits that, quote, necks were cut off for Abu Bakr and his caliphate. So it's fair to say that he was no Gandhi.
Under such a reign of terror, who in their right mind is going to risk their life and the sanctity of his wife and children to come forward and openly attest to the ambush on the house of Fatima? The best you can expect in such circumstances is a different kind of evidence.
No crime scene is ever that straightforward. Apprehending the criminal in the act of a premeditated murder is exceedingly rare. That is why forensics experts and crime scene investigators are brought in to comb the site and gather evidence. Like a jigsaw puzzle, these clues are pieced together with diligence to form a coherent picture and solve the case. The existence of compelling circumstantial evidence is enough to raise serious questions and often convict criminals. But as with any historical event, we do not possess fingerprints or murder weapons. So we must forensically comb the circumstances, testimonies, and eyewitness reports and rely on inferences to either convict or exonerate the suspects. And as we shall see, there is a plethora of textual evidence that no objective person can ignore. Also, it's easy to get lost in the individual parts of the puzzle when viewed in isolation. This is why they have to be contextualized and put together to form the bigger picture. If we saw a report that said Fatima was angry with Abu Bakr, most people wouldn't bat an eye. But putting that report in the context of the broader body of evidence makes it a crucial piece of the jigsaw. Now, of course, this is going to be covered up. Remember, this crime was orchestrated by the same camp that later declared open war against Imam Ali at the bloody battles of Jamal and Siffin. It's the same cult that later assassinated Imam al-Hassan, and the very same band that mercilessly slaughtered Imam al-Hussein in broad daylight along with his children after depriving them of water for 3 days. Only a naive person would expect anything else.
Fatima's relationship with her father went beyond that of a father and his daughter. It wasn't based on emotions and sentimentality. Rather, this inspired prophet, whose every word is a divine revelation, sums up his relationship with Fatima by declaring, "Fatima is a part of me. Whoever angers her has angered me." This makes Fatima a barometer of divine wrath and pleasure.
From a biographical perspective, Fatima was the Prophet's only surviving child. Prophetic lineage continued through her. She was the daughter of the Prophet's first and most beloved wife, Khadija. She was orphaned at the age of 5 when she lost her mother due to a brutal economic blockade. Fatima stood by her father's side and was so close to him, he awarded her the label her father's mother, Ummu Abiha. He has also said, Fatima is the mistress of the women of paradise. Despite her young age and reclusive life, Fatima was known for her knowledge and piety. She was only 18 years old at the time of the Prophet's death, while the Sunni camp says she was slightly older, but that's besides the point. At the time, she was pregnant with her 4th child, one that the Prophet had said would be a boy and had already chosen his name, Muhsin. Muhsin died as a result of the miscarriage, induced by the ambush on the house and the beating that Fatima sustained. At most, she lived just 6 months after her father, while reliable reports put her death a mere 45 days after the Prophet.
The following is a condensed timeline of events that led to the attack on the house of Fatima. Monday, June 8th, 632 CE.
The Prophet is announced to have passed away. Plans were already in place for a swift takeover. A group led by Abu Bakr and Umar, which included Abu Ubaid al-Jarrah, Abdul Rahman ibn Auf, and others, absconded with the Prophet's body and his burial rites to assemble in a shack called Saqifat Bani Sa'ida. Omar, as reported by Bukhari, describes chaotic, violent, and farcical scenes of bickering parties who were literally at each other's throats vying for power, in which Sa'd ibn Ubadah, a leader of the Ansar, was killed and his murder blamed on, guess who? Ghosts. After a brawl, the dust settled with Abu Bakr's party taking over. He quickly mobilized to impose a pledge of loyalty on the general public, but especially those deemed as a threat. Omar even recounts that their plan was a fluke whose, quote, evil was averted.
Tuesday, June 9th.
The next day, Omar was sent to force Ali into submission, despite the fact that Ali and the Prophet's family were still grieving and occupied with burying the Prophet. At some point, while Ali and Zubayr were outside, his wife Fatima and children were still at home. Instead of offering condolences to a grieving family for the loss of their father, Omar appears at the scene and threatens to, quote, burn down the house on those inside, end quote, if Ali and Zubayr did not give their pledge of allegiance to Abu Bakr.
Wednesday, June 10th.
Having realized that Ali and his companions weren't going to surrender willingly, Omar went to the house to execute what he had threatened to do the previous day. This time he had dozens of men, including Abu Bakr's tribesmen Qunfudh al-Adawi, al-Mughira ibn Shu'bah, Khalid ibn al-Walid, among others. This band encircles the small house of Fatima from all directions. Meanwhile, Ali, Fatima, and their sons Hassan and Hussein, their daughter Zainab, and their housemate Fidda were all inside the house. Omar makes one final ultimatum, that he will burn the house down if Ali doesn't present himself to offer Abu Bakr his loyalty pledge. Ali knows that if he comes out, there would be blood. So he avoids a confrontation and an all-out war by staying inside. Fatima, on the other hand, chooses to address Omar, given that she is both a woman as well as the only person who claimed prophetic bloodline. After a verbal exchange, Omar moves to order firewood to be set alight at the door of the house of Fatima. Fatima admonishes him. She pleads with him to leave, but he continues the siege until the door was almost completely burnt. With the house filling with smoke, Omar knocks down the door, crushing Fatima behind it. In the ensuing moments after the ambush, Fatima sustained multiple lethal injuries. A large nail in the door pierces through her chest. She miscarries her child, the Prophet's fourth grandson, Muhsin. At least one of her ribs is shattered by blunt force. Fatima falls unconscious by the door. Ali is then violently apprehended and tied with ropes. As he is led to the mosque to face Abu Bakr, Fatima regains consciousness and attempts to stop them. While she struggles to hold on to her husband, another assault is ordered. Multiple assailants this time proceed to beat her with their sheaths and their sticks. In the pandemonium and mad hysteria, she is slapped, shoved, kicked, and left lying on the ground, unconscious again and bleeding from several wounds and injuries. Ali was coerced into a pledge to Abu Bakr, then released under a de facto house arrest. For the next 75 days and nights, Fatima suffered quietly from pain and anguish, her health deteriorating day after day. On the 75th day, she specifically instructed her husband to bury her at night and to not inform those that had oppressed her of the funeral and even to conceal her grave. Finally, Fatima succumbed to her injuries and died at the tender age of 18, leaving behind 3 young children under the age of 7 and a husband who grieved her loss for the rest of his life.
Omar attacked the house not of Ali but of Fatima, because Muhammad had built for his daughter. He had built this house and this belonged to her. And he, of course, threatened to burn it down with all the people inside, Fatima and her daughters and Ali.
The Jigsaw Puzzle. Exhibit A.
Our trail of evidence begins with the single most authoritative and reliable Sunni collection of hadith, known as Sahih, meaning authentic, by Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari. In that book, he quotes, فَوَجَدَتْ فَاطِمَةٌ على أبي بكر في ذلك فهجرته فلم تكلمه حتى توفيت وعاشت بعد النبي 6 أشهر. فلما توفيت دفنها زوجها علي ليلا ولم يؤذن بها أبا بكر وصلى عليها. Bukhari reports through what is deemed a very strong chain of narrators leading up to Aisha, a person who wasn't a friend of Ali and Fatima by any stretch of the imagination, as she went on to wage war against Ali. Yet even she admits that Fatima was deeply angry with Abu Bakr. Remember that Aisha was Abu Bakr's daughter, so if anything, she would have been biased in his favor. Yet she says that Fatima was so angry with Abu Bakr that she never spoke to him again until her death, and that Ali buried her in the dead of night and refused to inform Abu Bakr at her instructions. The conclusions we can draw directly from this report are: number one, Fatima was angry with and hurt by Abu Bakr. That's a fact. Number two, Fatima's anger did not subside until she died, meaning that she never forgave him. The Prophet says in no ambiguous terms, "Whoever angers Fatima angers me." And what does that say about the one who angered Fatima until she died embittered with him? Now let's stop here for a minute to appreciate the gravity of this. Because the other side often zooms in on one specific piece of the puzzle, that one act, like the breaking of the ribs or the nail in the door, and they try to drill holes in it as a means of distraction from the bigger picture. And while we will provide all those pieces of evidence, let's not lose sight of the biggest crime here, that the Caliph hurt Fatima and angered her. In doing so, he shook the heavens as he angered God's final messenger. That in itself is the greatest, most grotesque, most unforgivable crime they could have committed. A crime that no amount of concocted fables or fabricated stories could ever cover up. So when they say, "But what about the fire or the nail or the door?" don't fall for it. It's a distraction. We have evidence for the other transgressions and we will provide them. But let's not gloss over their caliph's transgression against God himself. And by the way, speaking of false concoctions, I've addressed the story of the daughter of Abu Jahl in a Q&A. It's a lie perpetuated by Nasibis that insults the Prophet as well as Fatima and Imam Ali. So, to preserve whatever trace of dignity you have, let's not even go there right now. Ibn Taymiyyah, who was well known for his hostility and animus towards the Shia, and is the quintessential hate preacher whose books are taught in both Saudi Arabia as well as ISIS religious schools. This man, when it comes to searching for ways to whitewash the crimes of the caliphate, he bends in more ways than you can imagine. And yet, in his Minhaj al-Sunnah, he eventually concedes and says, and I quote, "The most we can say is that he," meaning the caliph, "ambushed the house to search for God's money that he should repossess to distribute." End quote. Then continuing to say that doing so is within the purview of the caliph. In acknowledging as much, not only does Ibn Taymiyyah accept the ambush, but he justifies it by accusing Imam Ali of possessing unlawful funds. There is more than just a hint of his hatred towards Imam Ali in this one statement alone. So make of that what you may.
Exhibit B.
This report is perhaps the most compelling evidence. It comes from Ibn Abi Shayba al-Absi, one of the oldest chronicles of hadith, as the author was born in 325 after Hijrah. Al-Dhahabi attests to his reliability in his Siyar A'lam al-Nubala and says Ibn Abi Shayba requires no introduction. He's an imam and an icon and the master of those that preserve the hadith. So, a very reliable source who presents a reliable chain of narrators that Bukhari refers to in his own book. This report is narrated by an authentic chain to Aslam, a slave of Umar, presumably quoting his master, that Ali and Zubayr would go to Fatima to consult her on how to deal with Abu Bakr's takeover of the caliphate. When Umar heard about this, he went to Fatima telling her, "O daughter of God's messenger, we love no one more than your father, and after him we love no one more than you. Yet that will not stop me from ordering your house to be burnt on their heads if these men assembled with you again." When Umar left, Ali and Zubayr allegedly came back. Fatima allegedly told them that Umar had sworn to burn down the house upon you should you return here again, and I swear by God that he would do what he threatened to do, so leave me and do not return. So they left and didn't return until they gave their pledge to the caliph. Sunni scholars of hadith have verified this report to be sound and attested that the narrators are reliable, making the report as authentic as any hadith can be. A few things we can draw from this specific report. Number one, Umar explicitly threatened to burn the house down on all those in it. This simply cannot be glossed over, and here's why. First of all, when a person's death is shrouded in mystery, the first people investigated are those that may have threatened to kill the deceased. This makes Umar the primary suspect in any murder investigation, and he loses any impunity due to holding high office or being a companion. B, threatening to commit deadly arson with intent to kill is a crime in every legal jurisdiction. Even the threat in itself, you can't gloss over this. The threat itself is a grave sin in Islam. Al-Dhahabi reports the Prophet as having said, "Whoever terrorizes the people of Medina will be terrorized by God and will be cursed by God and the angels and all the people." This is in Sahih Bukhari, Muslim, and Ahmad bin Hanbal. They've all reported variants of this hadith. So to terrorize and threaten Fatima of all people, the daughter of the Prophet and mother of his grandchildren, or Ali ibn Abi Talib, is itself an unthinkably heinous crime. Also, do I need to draw your attention again to the fact that Umar doesn't threaten Ali and Zubayr directly to their face? Instead, he chooses to terrorize a lonely woman at her home by going over to intimidate her into submission. We'll have to dedicate an entire different session to his track record in resorting to violence against women. Because even though there are no reliable reports of him fighting on the battlefield, because should we even talk about the scandal in Khaybar? There is plenty of evidence of him attacking helpless women, including his own sister when she chose to become a Muslim. Finally, in case anyone claims this was an empty threat that would never materialize, simply note how Fatima swears at the end of the hadith that he was going to carry out his threat, and how Ali and Zubayr both agree with her, hence not assembling at her house once again. So this was far from a bluff. It was a credible threat by a man with an actual track record. 2, this was in response to her advising Ali and Zubayr on how to deal with Abu Bakr, presumably because she wanted them to abstain from pledging their allegiance to him. This goes to prove that unlike the rosy image of the caliph's early days where it's alleged that everything was hunky-dory, that everyone submitted, that everyone elected him, this report shows that pledges of loyalty were forcefully extracted through terror and an iron fist, including from the Prophet's immediate family members. Now, the fact that Umar mentions his love for the Prophet and his daughter is further condemnation of his acts, as he's openly declaring his willingness to trample on everything that is holy and kill the Prophet's family with full knowledge of who they are, and that their position with the Messenger will not deter him from killing them all in the most brutal manner imaginable, which is to be burnt to death.
At this point, we no longer have mere breadcrumbs. We have a motive, a credible report of threats to commit murder, a prime suspect, as well as a plethora of reasons to suspect the threats were in fact carried out.
One last point about this report. is that innumerable Sunni sources have reported it and acknowledged its authenticity, but have used multiple tactics to distort it, including redacting the damning portions of the threat, leaving only the part about how much Umar loved the Prophet and his daughter. Or they've redacted the hadith and replaced the threat to murder the Prophet's family with a generic quote unquote, he then said some things, end quote. Or even suggesting that some reports of the Prophet threatening the hypocrites of the same can be applied here, forgetting that Umar was no prophet and that Fatima is the mistress of the women of the worlds.
Exhibit C.
Ibn Qutaybah al-Daynuri in his book Al-Imamatu was-Siyasa. Ibn Qutaybah was a highly regarded early Islamic scholar, exegete, polymath, and hadith master. He died in the year 276 after Hijrah. He offers several clues and even pieces of direct evidence implicating the regime in the murder of Fatima. His most damning report that chronicles the ambush in vivid terms is in his book Al-Imamah was-Siyasa. So of course, some will attempt to cast doubt on the authenticity of the book, despite the fact that early bibliographical works have attributed the book to none other than Ibn Qutaybah. Among the mainstream and reliable scholars that have confirmed the attribution are Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, Ibn al-Arabi, both of whom even admonish Ibn Qutaybah for exposing what they call disputes among the companions that should not have been revealed. For example, one quote that you find in this book is this: as for Muhsin, he died from the crushing of Qunfudh al-Adawi. This is an incredibly damning report, given that Qunfudh was known to be a close associate of the coup leaders and was even appointed to the post of governor of Mecca after the attack as a reward for his role in stifling the dissent and his attack on the house of Fatima alayhi salam. No historian is as influential and authoritative as At-Tabari. Tabari, as well as other prominent historians such as Ibn Kathir and Ibn Qutaybah, report the following. When Umar came to the door of the house of Fatima, he said, "By Allah, I shall burn down the house over you unless you come out and give the oath of allegiance," meaning to the Caliph. Now we get to the most damning evidence, the actual confession of the Caliph before his death. Even though we've been saying that this case is based on circumstantial evidence, and there is plenty of it as we've seen, but there is one big direct piece of evidence that conclusively implicates the Caliph in the ambush and all subsequent events. It comes in the form of a deathbed confession, and it's been reported by a number of Sunni scholars and historians. And it reads as such: Abu Bakr said on his deathbed, "I wish I had not conquered Fatima's house."
With this clear admission of guilt and verified confession, the Caliph connects the final dots and pieces together our puzzle. According to him, the ambush clearly took place and he played a central role in that horrific and earth-shattering act. His regret stems from the fact that Fatima was the anomaly they failed to account for in their plot. It was this young and seemingly meek woman who single-handedly exposed the entire scheme and will forever act as the sign that something in this carefully forged, rosy image of the caliphate just doesn't add up, that it is history's biggest cover-up.
One last point is, while we did say we would only use Sunni references to make our case, isn't it fair to at least listen to the family of Fatima, the Ahlul Bayt, and the prophetic household? Shouldn't Fatima's husband and children, who were paragons of knowledge, piety, and purity, get to testify to what happened to their mother? Every victim gets their day in court where they can face the accused and address the public, yet somehow the Ahlul Bayt don't even get a say? And that right there is the biggest oppression after the crime itself, that no one stops to ask, well, what does Fatima herself say about all of this? Why do Sunni sources give the Caliph the podium yet refuse to narrate the sermon of Fatima? As a Sunni viewer, I ask you in God's name, have you heard Fatima's sermon on Fadak? Have you heard that Imam al-Hasan says to Mughira ibn Shu'bah, who was one of the savages who took part in the ambush, وَأَنْتَ الَّذِي ضَرَبْتَ فَاطِمَةَ بِنْتَ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ حَتَّى أَدْمَيْتَهَا وَأَلْقَتْ مَا فِي بَطْنِهَا. Have you, my dear viewer, thought about why Imam Ali continued to tell his inner circle that the second caliph awarded the governorship of Mecca to Qunfudh, the one that we mentioned earlier, and did not charge him any taxes because, and I quote, شَكَرَ لَهُ ضَرْبَةً ضَرَبَهَا فَاطِمَةَ عَلَيْهَا السَّلَامِ بِالصَّوْتِ فَمَاتَتْ وَإِنَّ فِي عَضُدِهَا أَثَرُهُ كَأَنَّهُ الدُّمْلُجِ. Because he was rewarding him for what he did to Fatima. Should we not listen to these? Should we not give the Ahlul Bayt a voice? Should we not learn about the sermon of Fatima to Zahra about Fadak? So my appeal to all of you, whether you're Shia or Sunni, Muslim or non-Muslim, it really doesn't matter. I beseech you to take a moment and read through the sermon of Fatima known as the Fadakiyya. Because that sermon not only reveals the truth of what happened from the perspective of Fatima herself, the victim of this heinous crime, not only does it expose the travesty of justice that occurred after the death of the Holy Prophet, not only is it an incredibly valuable historical piece, but it's Islam in a nutshell. That sermon encompasses the teachings of the Holy Messenger of God in a few short pages. And it would be an injustice to ourselves not to know about it, not to study it, not to learn it, not to even read it once in our lives. This is my appeal to each and every one of you.
And so there it is. After 1,400 years of systematic persecution, state-sponsored terrorism, government deception, book burnings, and political assassinations, the truth comes out nonetheless. What we have presented, when combined, produces a sound louder than any gunshot, a scream that reverberates through history, that Fatima was ambushed, that she was crushed, that her home was burnt, that her son was killed, and that she was martyred as a result of her injuries. Her voice echoes through the ages and cannot be silenced. Like the blood of John the Baptist, it will continue to boil until justice is finally served and the killers forced to reckon with their crimes. We can simply dismiss all of this and refuse to even acknowledge these events, as many do, but that would be a betrayal of our own moral compass. Given the severity of the alleged crimes and the gravity of their repercussions, we owe it to ourselves to know the truth, or at least never stop asking questions. Fatima.